All right. Good evening, pretty shiny peoples. Well, good morning. I'm used to saying good evening. Listen to me. Good morning, pretty shiny peoples. So, work got super busy this week, and I had some other stuff pop up. Why is there an echo? There we go. I had some other stuff pop up, and so I was not able to reread part 8 yet. So, I'm doing that this morning, and then we will do part 9 this evening, and we will finish book 2. Now, my dogs will probably still bark. There will probably still be squeaky toys involved, all of that good stuff. But hopefully, I don't read on mute for 20 to 25 minutes today. So, this is just for the people who didn't catch it live last time and get to laugh at me and all that good stuff. So, I'm just going to reread that and then we will do the last part tonight. Okay. Hey, Green. All right, so we started at reshuffle last time and we ended, was it chapter 2 or chapter 3 of the Pusher? Does anybody remember? I probably should have looked at, I think I read through chapter 2 and we're going to start with chapter 3 this evening just to be consistent. Okay. Good morning. So, yes, part 9. I know we did part 8 last week, but there were a lot of mishaps. So this morning we're doing part 8 again, and this evening we will do part 9. Well, I say this evening, it might be late afternoon. It depends on my errands, but yeah, we will go ahead and finish book 2 tonight. Okay. Reshuffle. To Eddie Dean, he and the lady no longer seemed to be trudging or even walking up what remained of the beach. They seemed to be flying. Odetta Holmes still neither liked nor trusted Roland, that was clear, but she recognized how desperate his condition had become and responded to that. Now, instead of pushing the dead clump of steel and rubber to which a human body just happened to be attached, Eddie felt almost as if he were pushing a glider. Go with her. Before, I was watching out for you, and that was important. Now, I'll only slow you down. He came to realize how right the gunslinger was almost at once. Eddie pushed the chair. Odetta pumped it. One of the gunslinger's revolvers was stuck in the waistband of Eddie's pants. Do you remember when I told you to be on your guard and you weren't? Yes. I'm telling you again. Be on your guard. Every moment. If her other comes back, don't wait even a second. Brain her. What if I kill her? Then it's the end. But if she kills you, that's the end too. And if she comes back, she'll try. She'll try. Eddie hadn't wanted to leave him. It wasn't just that cat scream in the night, although he kept thinking about it. It was simply that Roland had become his only touchstone in this world. He and Odetta didn't belong here. Still, he realized that the gunslinger had been right. Do you want to rest? He asked Odetta. There's more food. A little. Not yet, she answered, although her voice sounded tired. Soon. All right, but at least stop pumping. You're weak. Your your stomach, you know? All right. She turned, her face gleaming with sweat, and favored him with a smile that both weakened and strengthened him. He could have died for such a smile, and thought he would if circumstances demanded. He hoped to Christ circumstances wouldn't, but it surely wasn't out of the question. Time had become something so crucial, it seemed. It so crucial, it screamed. She put her hands in her lap and he went on pushing. The tracks the chair left behind were now dimmer. The beach had become steadily firmer, but it was also littered with rubble that could cause an accident. You wouldn't have to help one happen at the speed they were going. A really bad accident might hurt Odetta, and that would be bad. Such an accident could also wreck the wheelchair, and that would be bad for them, and probably worse for the gunslinger, who would almost surely die alone. And if Roland died, they would be trapped in this world forever. With Roland too sick and weak to walk, Eddie had been forced to face one simple fact. There were 3 people here, and 2 of them were cripples. So what hope, what chance was there? The chair. The chair was the hope, the whole hope, and nothing but the hope. So help them God. The gunslinger had regained consciousness shortly after Eddie dragged him into the shade of a rock outcropping. His face, where it was not ashy, was a hectic red. His chest rose and fell rapidly. His right arm was a network of twisting red lines. Feed her, he croaked at Eddie. You, never mind me. I'll be all right. Feed her. She'll eat now, I think, and you'll need her strength. Roland, what if she's just pretending to be? The gunslinger gestured impatiently. She's not pretending to be anything except alone in her body. I know it, and you do too. It's in her face. Feed her, for the sake of your father, and while she eats, come back to me. Every minute counts now. Every second. Eddie got up, and the gunslinger pulled him back with his left hand. Sick or not, his strength was still there. And say nothing about the other. Whatever she tells you, however she explains it, don't contradict her. Why? I don't know. I just know it's wrong. Now do as I say and don't waste any more time. Odetta had been sitting in her chair looking out at the sea with an expression of mild and bemused amazement when Eddie offered her the chunks of lobster left over from the previous night. She smiled ruefully. I would if I could, she said, but you know what happens. Eddie, who had no idea what she was talking about, could only shrug and say, It wouldn't hurt to try again, Odetta. You need to eat, you know. We've got to go as fast as we can. She laughed a little and touched his hand. He felt something like an electric charge jump from her to him, and it was her, Odetta. He knew it as well as Roland did. I love you, Eddie. You have tried so hard, been so patient. So is he. She nodded toward the place where the gunslinger lay propped against the rocks, watching. But he is a hard man to love. Yeah, don't I know it? I'll try one more time. For you. She smiled, and he felt all the world move for her, because of her, and he thought, please, God, I have never had so much, so please don't take her from me again, please. She took the chunks of lobster meat, wrinkled her nose in a rueful comic expression, and looked up at him. Must I? Just give it a shot, he said. I never ate scallops again, she said. Pardon? I thought I told you. You might have, he said, and gave a little nervous laugh. What the gunslinger had said about not letting her know about the other loomed very large inside his mind just then. We had them for dinner one night when I was 10 or 11. I hated the way they tasted, like little rubber balls, and later I vomited them up. I never ate them again. But, she sighed, as you say, I'll give it a shot. She put a piece in her mouth like a child taking a spoonful of medicine she knows will taste nasty. She chewed slowly at first, then more rapidly. She swallowed, took another piece, chewed, swallowed, another. Now she was nearly wolfing it. Whoa, slow down, Eddie said. It must be another kind. That's it. Of course it is. She looked at Eddie shiningly. We've moved further up the beach, and the species has changed. I'm no longer allergic, it seems. It doesn't taste nasty like it did before. And I did try to keep it down, didn't I? She looked at him nakedly. I tried very hard. Yeah. To himself, he sounded like a radio broadcasting a very distant signal. She thinks she's been eating every day and then upchucking everything. She thinks that's why she's so weak. Christ almighty. Yeah, you tried like hell. It tastes. The words were hard to pick up because her mouth was full. It tastes so good, she laughed. The sound was delicate and lovely. It's going to stay down. I'm going to take nourishment. I know it. I can feel it. Just don't overdo it, he cautioned, and gave her one of the water skins. You're not used to it. All that. He swallowed, and there was an audible to him at least, click in his throat. All that throwing up. Yes, yes. I need to talk to Roland for a few minutes. All right. But before he could go, she grasped his hand again. Thank you, Eddie. Thank you for being so patient. And thank him. She paused gravely. Thank him, and don't tell him that he scares me. I won't, Eddie said, and he went back to the gunslinger. Even when she wasn't pushing, Odetta was a help. She navigated with she navigated with the precision of a woman who had spent a long time weaving a wheelchair through a world that would not acknowledge handicapped people such as her for years to come. Left, she'd call, and Eddie would gee to the left, gliding past a rock, snarling out of the pasty grit like a decayed fang. On his own, he might have seen it. Or maybe not. Right, she called, and Eddie hawed right, barely missing one of the increasingly rare sand traps. They finally stopped, and Eddie lay down, breathing hard. Sleep, Odetta said. An hour, and I'll wake you. Eddie looked at her. I'm not lying. I observed your friend's condition, Eddie. He's not exactly my friend, and I know how important time is. I won't let you sleep longer than an hour out of a misguided sense of mercy. I can tell the sun quite well. You won't do that man any good by wearing yourself out, will you? No, he said, thinking. But you don't understand. If I sleep and Detta Walker comes back. Sleep, Eddie, she said, and since Eddie was too weary and too much in love to do other than trust her, he did. He slept, and she woke him when she said she would, and she was still Odetta, and they went on. And now she was pumping again, helping. They raced up the diminishing beach toward the door Eddie kept frantically looking for and kept not seeing. When he left Odetta eating her first meal in days and went back to the gunslinger, Roland seemed a little better. Hunker down, he said to Eddie. Eddie hunkered. Leave me the skin that's half full. All I need. Take her to the door. What if I don't find it? You'll find it. The first two were there. This one will be too. If you get there before sundown tonight, wait for dark, and then kill double. You'll need to leave her food and make sure she's sheltered as well as she can be. If you don't reach it tonight, kill triple. Here. He handed over one of his guns. Eddie took it with respect, surprised as before by how heavy it was. I thought the shells were all losers. Probably are, but I've loaded with the ones I believe were wetted least. 3 from the buckle side of the left belt, 3 from the buckle side of the right. 1 may fire, 2 if you're lucky. Don't try them on the crawlies. His eyes considered Eddie briefly. There may be other things out there. You heard it too, didn't you? If you mean something yowling in the hills, yes. If you mean the bugger man, as your eyes say, no. I heard a wild cat in the breaks, that's all. Maybe with a voice 4 times the size of its body. It may be nothing you can't drive off with a stick. But there's her to think about. If the other comes back, you may have to... I won't kill her if that's what you're thinking. You may have to wing her, you understand? Eddie gave a reluctant nod. Goddamn shells probably wouldn't fire anyway, so there was no sense getting his panties in a bunch about it. When you get to the door, leave her. Shelter her as well as you can, and come back to me with the chair. And the gun? The gunslinger's eyes blazed so brightly that Eddie snapped his head back, as if Roland had thrust a flaming torch in his face. Gods, yes. Leave her with a loaded gun? And when her other might come back at any time? Are you insane? The shells. Fuck the shells, the gunslinger cried. And a freak drop in the wind allowed the words to carry. Odetta turned her head, looked at them for a long moment, and then looked back toward the sea. Leave it with her not. Eddie kept his voice low in case the wind should drop again. What if something comes down from the breaks while I'm on my way back here? Some kind of cat 4 times bigger than its voice instead of the other way around. Something you can't drive off with a stick. Give her a pile of stones, the gunslinger said. Stones? Jesus wept. Man, you are such a fucking shit. I am thinking, the gunslinger said, something you seem unable to do. I gave you the gun so you could protect her from the sort of danger you're talking about, for half the trip you must take. Would it please you if I took the gun back? Then perhaps you could die for her. Would that please you? Very romantic. Except then, instead of just her, all 3 of us would go down. Very logical. You're still a fucking shit, however. Go or stay. Stop calling me names." "You forgot something," Eddie said furiously. "What was that?" "You forgot to tell me to grow up. That's what Henry always used to say. 'Oh, grow up, kid.'" The gunslinger had smiled, a weary, oddly beautiful smile. "I think you have grown up. Will you go or stay?" "I'll go," Eddie said. "What are you going to eat?" She scarfed the leftovers. "The fucking shit will find a way. The fucking shit has been finding one for years." Eddie looked away. "I guess I'm sorry I called you that, Roland. It's been." He laughed suddenly, shrilly. "It's been a very trying day." Roland smiled again. "Yes," he said, "it has." They made the best time of the entire trek that day, but there was still no door in sight when the sun began to spill its gold track across the ocean. Although she told him she was perfectly capable of going on for another half an hour, he called a halt and helped her out of the chair. He carried her to an even patch of ground that looked fairly smooth, got the cushions from the back of the chair and the seat, and eased them under her. "Lord, it feels so good to stretch out," she sighed, but her brow clouded. "I keep thinking of that man back there, Roland, all by himself, and I can't really enjoy it. Eddie, who is he? What is he?" And almost as an afterthought, "And why does he shout so much?" "Just his nature, I guess," Eddie said, and abruptly went off to gather rocks. Roland hardly ever shouted. He guessed some of it was this morning, fuck the shells, but the rest of it was false memory. The time she thought she had been Odetta. He killed triple, as the gunslinger had instructed, and was so intent on the last that he skipped back from a fourth, which had been closing in on his right with only an instant to spare. He saw the wait's claws clicked on the empty space which had been occupied by his foot and leg a moment before, and thought of the gunslinger's missing fingers. Eddie cooked over a dry wood fire. The encroaching hills and increasing vegetation made the search for good fuel quicker and easier, and that was one thing, while the last of the daylight faded from the western sky. "Look, Eddie," she cried, pointing up. He looked and saw a single star gleaming on the breast of the night. "Isn't it beautiful?" "Yes," he said, and suddenly, for no reason, his eyes filled with tears. Just where had he been all of his goddamn life? Where had he been, and what had he been doing? Who had been with him while he did it, and why did he suddenly feel so grimy and abysmally beshitted? Her lifted face was terrible in its beauty, irrefutable in this light, but the beauty was unknown to its possessor, who only looked at the star with wide, wondering eyes and laughed softly. "Starlight, star bright," she said, and stopped. She looked at him. "Do you know it, Eddie?" "Yeah." And Eddie kept his head down. His voice sounded clear enough, but if he looked up, she would see he was weeping. "Then help me. But you have to look." "Okay." He wiped the tears into the palm of one hand and looked up at the star with her. "Starlight." She looked at him and he joined her. "Star bright." Her hand reached out, groping, and he clasped it. One the delicious brown of light chocolate, the other the delicious white of dove's breast. "First star I see tonight." They spoke solemnly in unison, boy and girl for this now, not man and woman as they would be later, when the dark was full, and she called to ask him if he was asleep, and he said no, and she asked if he would hold her because she was cold. "Wish I may, wish I might." They looked at each other, and he saw the tears were streaming down her cheeks. His own came again, and he let them fall in her sight. This was not shame, but an inexpressible relief. They smiled at each other. "Have the wish I wish tonight," Eddie said, and thought, please, always you. "Have the wish I wish tonight," she echoed, and thought, if I must die in this odd place, please let it not be too hard, and let this good young man be with me. "I'm sorry I cried," she said, wiping her eyes. "I don't usually, but it's been a very trying day," he finished for her. "Yes. And you need to eat, Eddie. You do too. I just hope it doesn't make me sick again." He smiled at her. "I don't think it will." Later, with strange galaxies turning and low gathered overhead, neither thought the act of love had ever been so sweet or so full. They were off with the dawn racing, and by 9, Eddie was wishing he had asked Roland what he should do if they came to a place where the hills cut off the beach and there was still no door in sight. It seemed a question of some importance, but the end of the beach was coming, no doubt about that. The hills marched ever closer, running in a diagonal line towards the water. The beach itself was no longer a beach at all. Not really. The soil was now firm and quite smooth. Something, runoff, he supposed, or flooding at some rainy season. There had been none since he had been in this world. Not a drop. The sky had clouded over a few times, but then the clouds had blown away again, had worn most of the jutting rocks away. At 9:30, Odetta cried, "Stop! Eddie, stop!" He stopped so abruptly that she had to grab the arms of the chair to keep from tumbling out. He was around in a flash. "I'm sorry," he said. "Are you all right?" "Fine." He saw he had mistaken excitement for distress. She pointed, "Up there. Do you see something?" He shaded his eyes and saw nothing. He squinted. For just a moment, he thought, no, it was surely just heat shimmer rising from the packed ground. "I don't think so," he said and smiled, "except maybe your wish." "I think I do." She turned in her excited, smiling face to him, standing all by itself, near where the beach ends. He looked again, squinting so hard this time his eyes watered. He thought again for just a moment that he saw something. "You did," he thought, and smiled. "You saw her wish." "Maybe," he said, not because he believed it, but because she did. "Let's go." Eddie went behind the chair again, taking a moment to massage his lower back where a steady ache had settled. She looked around. "What are you waiting for? You really think you've got it spotted, don't you?" "Yes." "Well then, let's go." Eddie started pushing again. Half an hour later, he saw it too. Jesus, he thought, her eyes are as good as Roland's. Maybe better. Neither wanted to stop for lunch, but they needed to eat. They made a quick meal and then pushed on again. The tide was coming in, and Eddie looked to the right, west, with the rising unease. They were still well above the tangled line of kelp and seaweed that marked the high water, but he thought that by the time they reached the door, they would be in an uncomfortably tight angle, bound by the sea on one side and the slanting hills on the other. He could see those hills were very, very clearly now. There was nothing pleasant about the view. They were rocky, studded with low trees that curled with roots into the ground like arthritic knuckles, keeping a grim grip in thorny looking bushes. They weren't really steep, but too steep for the wheelchair. He might be able to carry her up a way. Might, in fact, be forced to, but he didn't fancy leaving her there. For the first time, he was hearing insects. The sound was a little like crickets, but higher pitched than that, and with no swing of rhythm, just a steady, monotonous "ree" sound like power lines. For the first time, he was seeing birds other than gulls. Some some were biggies that circled inland on stiff wings. Hawks, he thought. He saw them fold their wings from time to time and plummet like stones, hunting. Hunting what? Well, small animals. That was all right. Yes, he kept thinking of that yowl he'd heard in the night. By mid-afternoon, they could see the third door clearly. Like the other two, it was an impossibility which nonetheless stood as stark as a post. "Amazing," he heard her say softly. "How utterly amazing." It was exactly where he had begun to surmise it would be, in the angle that marked the end of an easy northward progress. It stood just above the high tide line and less than 90 yards from the place where the hills suddenly leaped out of the ground like a giant hand coated with gray-green brush instead of hair. The tide came full as the sun swooned toward the water, and at what might have been 4 o'clock. Odetta said so, and since she had said she was good at telling the sun, and because she was his beloved, Eddie believed her. They reached the door. They simply looked at it. Odetta in her chair with her hands in her lap, Eddie on the seaside. In one way, they looked at it as they had looked at the evening star the previous night, which is to say, as children look at things. But in another way, they looked differently. When they wished on the star, they had been children of joy. Now they were solemn, wondering, like children looking at the stark embodiment of a thing which only belonged in a fairy tale. 2 words were written on this door. "What does it mean?" Odetta asked finally. "I don't know," Eddie said, but those words had brought a hopeless chill. He felt an eclipse stealing across his heart. Don't you? She asked, looking at him more closely. No, I. He swallowed. No. She looked at him a moment longer. Push me behind it, please. I'd like to see that. I know you want to get back to him, but would you do that for me? He would. They started around on the high side of the door. Wait, she cried. Did you see it? What? Go back. Look. Watch. This time he watched the door instead of what might be ahead to trip them up. As they went above it, he saw it narrow in perspective, saw its hinges, hinges which seemed to have been buried in nothing at all, saw its thickness. Then it was gone. The thickness of the door was gone. His view of the water should have been interrupted by 3, perhaps even 4 inches of solid wood. The door looked extraordinarily stout. But there was no such interruption. The door was gone. Its shadow was there, but the door was gone. He rolled the chair back 2 feet, so he was just south of the place where the door stood, and the thickness was there. You see it? He asked in a ragged voice. Yes, it's there again. He rolled the chair forward a foot, and the door was still there. Another 6 inches, still there. Another 2 inches, still there. Another inch, and it was gone. Solid gone. Jesus, he whispered. Jesus Christ. Would it open for you? She asked. Or me? He stepped forward slowly and grasped the knob of the door with those 2 words upon it. He tried clockwise, he tried anti-clockwise. The knob moved not an iota. All right. Her voice was calm, resigned. It's for him, then. I think we both knew it. Go for him, Eddie, now. First, I've got to see to you. I'll be fine. No, you won't. You're too close to the high tide line. If I leave you here, the lobsters are going to come out when it gets dark, and you're going to be up in the hills, a cat. A cat's coughing growl suddenly cut across what he was saying like a knife cutting thin cord. It was a good distance away, but closer than the other had been. Her eyes flicked to the gunslinger's revolver shoved into the waistband of his pants for just a moment, then back to his face. He felt a dull heat in his cheeks. He told you not to give it to me, didn't he? She said softly. He doesn't want me to have it. For some reason, he doesn't want me to have it. The shells got wet, he said awkwardly. They probably wouldn't fire anyway. I understand. Take me a little way up the slope, Eddie, can you? I know how tired your back must be. Andrew calls it wheelchair crouch, but if you take me up a little way, I'll be safe from the lobsters. I doubt if anything else comes very close to where they are. Eddie thought, when the tide's in, she's probably right, but what about when it starts to go out again? Give me something to eat and some stones, she said, and her unknowing echo of the gunslinger made Eddie flush again. His cheeks and forehead felt like the sides of a brick oven. She looked at him, smiled faintly, and shook her head as if he had spoken aloud. We're not going to argue about this. I saw how it is with him. His time is very, very short. There is no time for discussion. Take me up a little way, give me food and some stones, then take the chair and go. He got her fixed up as quickly as he could, then pulled the gunslinger's revolver and held it out to her butt first. But she shook her head. He'll be angry with both of us. Angry with you for giving, angrier with me for taking. Crap, Eddie yelled. What gave you that idea? I know, she said, and her voice was impervious. Well, suppose that's true. Just suppose. I'll be angry with you if you don't take it. Put it back. I don't like guns. I don't know how to use them. If something came at me in the dark, the first thing I'd do is wet my pants. The second thing I'd do is point it the wrong way and shoot myself. She paused, looking at Eddie solemnly. There's something else, and you might as well know it. I don't want to touch anything that belongs to him. Not anything. For me, I think his things might have what my ma used to call a hoodoo. I like to think myself a modern woman, but I don't want any hoodoo on me when you're gone and the dark lands on top of me. He looked from the gun to Odetta, and his eyes still questioned. Put it back, she said, stern as a schoolteacher. Eddie burst out laughing and obeyed. Why are you laughing? Because when you said that, you sounded like Miss Hathaway. She was my third grade teacher. She smiled a little, her luminous eyes never leaving his. She sang softly, sweetly. Heavenly shades of night are falling. It's twilight time. She trailed off, and they both looked west, but the star they had wished on the previous evening had not yet appeared, although their shadows had drawn long. Is there anything else, Odetta? He felt an urge to delay and delay. He thought it would pass once he was actually headed back, but now the urge to seize any excuse to remain seemed very, very strong. A kiss. I could do with that, if you don't mind. He kissed her long, and when their lips no longer touched, she caught his wrist and stared at him intently. I never made love with the white man before last night, she said. I don't know if that's important to you or not. I don't even know if it's important to me, but I thought you should know. He considered. Not to me, he said. In the dark, I think we were both gray. I love you, Odetta. She put a hand over his. You're a sweet young man, and perhaps I love you too, although it's too early for either of us. At that moment, as if given a cue, a wildcat growled in what the gunslinger had called the breaks. It still sounded 4 or 5 miles away, but that was still 4 or 5 miles closer than the last time they had heard it, and it sounded big. They turned their heads toward the sound. Eddie felt hackles trying to stand up on his neck. They couldn't quite make it. Sorry, Hackles, he thought stupidly. I guess my hair is just a little too long now. The growl rose to a tortured scream that sounded like a cry of some being suffering a horrid death. It might actually have signaled no more than a successful mating. It held for a moment, almost unbearable, and then it wound down, sliding through lower and lower registers until it was gone or buried beneath the ceaseless cry of the wind. They waited for it to come again, but the cry was not repeated. As far as Eddie was concerned, that didn't matter. He pulled the revolver out of his waistband again and held it out to her. Take it and don't argue. If you should need to use it, it won't do shit. That's how stuff like this always works, but take it anyway. Do you want an argument? Oh, you can argue. You can argue all you want. After a considering look into Eddie's almost hazel eyes, she smiled a little wearily. I won't argue, I guess. She took the gun. Please be as quick as you can. I will. He kissed her again, hurriedly this time, and almost told her to be careful, but seriously, folks, how careful could she be with the situation what it was? He picked his way back down the slope, through the deepening shadows. The Lobstrosities weren't out yet, but they would be putting in their nightly appearances soon. And look at the words written upon the door again. The same chill rose in his flesh. They were apt, those words. God, they were so apt. Then he looked back up the slope. For a moment he couldn't see her, and then he saw something move, the lighter brown of one palm. She was waving. He waved back, then turned the wheelchair and began to run with it tipped up in front of him so the smaller, more delicate front wheels would be off the ground. He ran south, back the way he had come. For the first half-hour or so, his shadow ran with him. The improbable shadow of a scrawny giant tacked to the soles of his sneakers and stretching long yards to the east. Then the sun went down. His shadow was gone, and the Lobstrosities began to tumble out of the waves. It was 10 minutes or so after he heard the first of the buzzing cries when he looked up and saw the evening star glowing calmly against the dark blue velvet of the sky. Heavenly shades of nights are falling. It's twilight time. Let her be safe. His legs were already aching, his breath too hot and heavy in his lungs, and there was still a third trip to make, this time with the gunslinger as his passenger. And although he guessed Roland must outweigh Detta by a full 100 pounds and knew he should conserve his strength, Eddie kept running anyway. Let her be safe. That's my wish. Let my beloved be safe. And like an ill omen, a wildcat screeched somewhere in the tortured ravines that cut through the hills. Only this wildcat sounded as big as a lion roaring in an African jungle. Eddie ran faster, pushing the untenanted gantry of a wheelchair before him. Soon the wind began to make a thin, ghastly whine through the freely turning spokes of the raised front wheels. The gunslinger heard a reedy, wailing sound approaching him, tensed for a moment, then heard the panting breath and relaxed. It was Eddie. Even without opening his eyes, he knew that. When the wailing sound faded and the running footsteps slowed, Roland opened his eyes. Eddie stood panting before him with sweat running down the sides of his face. His shirt was plastered against his chest in a single dark blotch. Any last vestiges of the college boy look Jack Andolini had insisted upon were gone. His hair hung over his forehead. He had split his pants at the crotch. The bluish-purple crescents under his eyes completed the picture. Eddie Dean was a mess. "I made it," he said. "I'm here." He looked around, then back at the gunslinger as if he could not believe it. "Jesus Christ, I'm really here." "You gave her the gun." Eddie thought the gunslinger looked bad. As bad as he'd looked before, the first abbreviated round of Keflex, maybe a trifle worse. Fever heat seemed to be coming off him in waves, and he knew he should have felt sorry for him. But for the moment, all he could seem to feel was mad as hell. "I bust my ass getting back here in record time, and all you can say is, 'You gave her the gun?' Thanks, man. I mean, I expected some expression of gratitude, but this is just over-fucking-whelming." "I think I said the only thing that matters." "Well, now that you mentioned it, I did," Eddie said, putting his hands on his hips and staring truculently down toward the gunslinger. Now, Now you have your choice. You can get in this chair, or I can fold it and try to jam it up your ass. Which do you prefer, master?" "Neither." Roland was smiling a little, the smile of a man who doesn't want to smile, but can't help it. "First, you're going to take some sleep, Eddie. We'll see what we'll see when the time for seeing comes, but for now, you need sleep. You're done in. I want to get back to her. I do too. But if you don't rest, you're going to fall down in the traces. Simple as that. Bad for you, worse for me, and worst of all, for her." Eddie stood for a moment, undecided. "You made good time," the gunslinger conceded. He squinted at the sun. "It's 4, maybe a quarter past. You sleep 5, maybe 7 hours, and it'll be full dark. 4. 4 hours. All right, until the dark. I think that's the important thing. Then you eat, then we move. You eat too." That faint smile again. "I'll try." He looked at Eddie calmly. "Your life is in my hands now. I suppose you know that." "Yes." "I kidnapped you." "Yes." "Do you want to kill me? If you do it now rather than subject any of us to—" His breath whistled out softly. Eddie heard his chest rattling and cared very little for the sound. "To any further discomfort," he finished. "I don't want to kill you." Then he was interrupted by a sudden harsh burst of coughing. "Lie down," he finished. Eddie did. Sleep did not drift upon him, as it sometimes did, but seized him with the rough hands of a lover who is awkward in her eagerness. He heard, or perhaps this was only a dream, Roland saying, "But you shouldn't have given her the gun." And then he was simply in the dark for an unknown time, and then Roland was shaking him awake, and when he finally sat up, all there seemed to be in his body was pain. Pain and weight. His muscles had turned into rusty winches and pulleys in a deserted building. His first effort to get to his feet didn't work. He thumped heavily back to the sand. He managed it on the second try, but he felt as if it might take him 20 minutes just to perform such a simple task as turning around, and it would hurt to do it. Roland's eyes were on him, questioning, "Are you ready?" Eddie nodded. "Yes, are you?" "Yes." "Can you?" "Yes." So they ate, and then Eddie began his third and last trip along this cursed stretch of beach. They rolled a good stretch that night, but Eddie was still dully disappointed when the gunslinger called a halt. He offered no disagreement because he was simply too weary to go on without rest, but he had hoped to get further. The weight, that was the big problem. Compared to Odetta, pushing Roland was like pushing a load of iron bars. Eddie slept 4 more hours before dawn, woke with the sun coming over the eroding hills, which were all that remained of the mountains, and listened to the gunslinger coughing. It was a weak cough, full of rails, the cough of an old man who may be coming down with pneumonia. Their eyes met. Roland's coughing spasms turned into a laugh. I'm not done yet, Eddie, no matter how I sound. Are you? Eddie thought of Odetta's eyes and shook his head. Not done, but I could use a cheeseburger and a bud. Bud? The gunslinger said doubtfully, thinking of apple trees and the spring flowers on the royal court gardens. Never mind. Hop in, my man. No four on the floor on no T-top, but we're going to roll some miles just the same. And they did. But when sunset came on the second day following his leave-taking of Odetta, they were still only drawing near the place of the third door. Eddie lay down, meaning to crash for another 4 hours, but the screaming cry of one of those cats jerked him out of sleep after only 2 hours, his heart thumping. God, the thing sounded fucking huge. He saw the gunslinger up on one elbow, his eyes gleaming in the dark. You ready? Eddie asked. He got slowly to his feet, grinning with pain. Are you? Roland asked again, very softly. Eddie twisted his back, producing a series of pops like a string of tiny firecrackers. Yeah, but I could really get behind that cheeseburger. I thought chicken was what you wanted. Eddie groaned. Cut me a break, man. The third door was in plain view by the time the sun cleared the hills. 2 hours later, they reached it. All together again, Eddie thought, ready to drop to the sand, but that was apparently not so. There was no sign of Odetta Holmes. No sign at all. Odetta! Eddie screamed, and now his voice was broken and hoarse as the voice of Odetta's other had been. There wasn't even an echo in return, something he might at least have mistaken for Odetta's voice. These low, eroded hills would not bounce sound. There was only the crash of the waves, much louder, in this tight arrowhead of land, the rhythmic, hollow boom of surf crashing to the end of some tunnel it had dug in the friable rock, and steady keening of the wind. Odetta! This time he screamed so loudly his voice broke, and for a moment something sharp, like a jag of fishbone, tore at his vocal cords. His eyes scanned the hills frantically, looking for the lighter patch of brown that would be her palm, looking for movement as she stood up, looking, God forgive him, for bright splashes of blood on rowan-colored rock. He found himself wondering what he would do if he saw that, or found the revolver, now with deep tooth marks driven into the smooth sandalwood of the grips. The sight of something like that might drive him into hysteria, might even run him crazy, but he looked for it, or something, just the same. His eyes saw nothing. His ears brought not the faintest returning cry. The gunslinger, meanwhile, had been studying the third door. He had expected a single word, the word the man in black had used as he turned the 6th tarot card at the dusty Golgotha where they had held palaver. Death. Walter had said, but not for you, gunslinger. There was not one word writ upon this door, but two, and neither of them was death. He read it again, lips moving soundlessly. The pusher. Yet, it means death, Roland thought, and knew it was so. What made him look around was the sound of Eddie's voice moving away. Eddie had begun to climb the first slope, still calling Odetta's name. For a moment, Roland considered just letting him go. He might find her. Might even find her alive, not too badly hurt, and still herself. He supposed the two of them might even make a life of sorts for themselves here. That Eddie's love for Odetta and hers for him might somehow smother the nightshade who called herself Detta Walker. Yes, between the two of them, he supposed it was possible that Detta might simply be squeezed to death. He was a romantic in his own harsh way. Yet he was also realist enough to know that sometimes love actually did conquer all. As for himself, even if he was able to get the drugs from Eddie's world, which had almost cured him before, would they be able to cure him this time, or even make a start? He was now very sick, and he found himself wondering if perhaps things hadn't gone too far. His arms and his legs ached, his head thudded, his chest was heaving and full of snot. When he coughed, there was a painful grating in his left side, as if ribs were broken there. His left ear flamed. Perhaps, he thought, the time had come to end it, to just cry off. At this, Everything in him rose up in protest. "Eddie!" he cried, and there was no cough now. His voice was deep and powerful. Eddie turned, one foot on raw dirt, the other braced on a jutting spar of rock. "Go on," he said, and made a curious little sweeping gesture with his hand, a gesture that said he wanted to be rid of the gunslinger so he could be about his real business, the important business, the business of finding Odetta and rescuing her if rescue was necessary. "It's all right. Go on and get the stuff you need. We'll both be here when you get back." "I doubt that." "I have to find her." Eddie looked at Roland, and his gaze was very young and completely naked. "I mean, I really have to. I understand your love and your need," the gunslinger said. "But I want you to come with me this time, Eddie." Eddie stared at him for a long time, as if trying to credit what he was hearing. "Come with you," he said at last, bemused. "Come with you? Holy God, now I think I really have heard everything. Deedle, deedle, dumpkin, everything. Last time you were so determined I was going to stay behind, you were willing to take a chance on me cutting your throat. This time, you want to take a chance on something ripping hers right out." "That may have happened. That may have already happened," Roland said, although he knew it hadn't. The lady might be hurt, but he knew she wasn't dead. Unfortunately, Eddie did too. A week or 10 days without his drugs had sharpened his mind remarkably. He pointed at the door. "You know she's not. If she was, that goddamn thing would be gone, unless you were lying when you said it wasn't any good without all three of us." Eddie tried to turn back to the slope, but Roland's eyes held him nailed. "All right," the gunslinger said. His voice was almost as soft as it had been when he spoke past the hateful face and screaming voice of Detta to the woman trapped somewhere behind it. "She's alive. That being so, why does she not answer your calls?" "Well, one of those cat things may have carried her away." But Eddie's voice was weak. "The cat would have killed her, eaten what it wanted and left the rest. At most, it might have dragged her body into the shade so it could come back tonight and eat meat the sun perhaps hadn't yet spoiled. But if that was the case, the door would be gone. Cats aren't like some insects who paralyze their prey and carry them off to eat later, and you know it." "That isn't necessarily true," Eddie said. For a moment, he heard Odetta saying, "You should have been on the debate team, Eddie," and pushed the thought aside. "Could be a cat came for her and she tried to shoot it, but the first couple of shells in your gun were misfires. Hell, maybe even the first 4 or 5. The cat gets to her, mauls her, and just before it can kill her, bang!" Eddie smacked a fist against his palm, seeing all this so vividly he might have witnessed it. "The bullet kills the cat, or maybe just wounds it, or maybe just scares it off. What about that?" Mildly, Roland said. "We would have heard a gunshot." For a moment, Eddie could only stand muted, able to think of no counter argument. Of course they would have heard it. The first time they had heard one of those cats yowling, it had been 15, maybe 20 miles away, a pistol shot. He looked at Roland with sudden cunning. "Maybe you did," he said. "Maybe you heard the gunshot while I was asleep. It would have woken you. Not as tired as I am, man. I fall asleep. It's like being dead," the gunslinger said in the same mild voice. "I know the feeling." "Then you understand. But it's not being dead. Last night you were out, just like that. But when one of those cats screeched, you were awake and on your feet in seconds because of your concern for her. There was no gunshot, Eddie, and you know it. You would have heard it because of your concern for her." "So maybe she brained it with a rock," Eddie shouted. "How the hell do I know when I'm standing here arguing with you instead of checking out the possibilities? I mean, she could be lying up there someplace hurt, man, hurt or bleeding to death. How'd you like it if I did come through that door with you and she died while we were on the other side? How'd you like to look around once and see that doorway there, and then look around twice and see it gone, just like it never was, because she was gone? Then you'd be trapped in my world instead of the other way around." He stood panting and glaring at the gunslinger, his hands balled into fists. Roland felt a tired exasperation. Someone, it might have been Court, but he rather thought it had been his father, had had a saying: "Might as well try to drink the ocean with the spoon as argue with a lover." If any proof of that saying were needed, there it stood above him, in a posture that was all defiance and defense. Go on, the set of Eddie Dean's body said. Go on, and I can answer any question you throw at me. Might not have been a cat that found her, he said now. This may be your world, but I don't think you've been to this part of it any more than I've ever been to Borneo. You don't know what might be running around up in those hills, do you? Could be an ape grabbed her, or something like that. Something grabbed her, all right, the gunslinger said. Well, thank God getting sick hasn't driven all the sense out of your. And we both know that it was Detta Walker. That's what grabbed her. Detta Walker. Eddie opened his mouth, but for some little time, only seconds, but enough of them so both acknowledged the truth. The gunslinger's inexorable face bore all his arguments to silence. It doesn't have to be that way. Come a little closer. If we're going to talk, every time I have to shout at you over the waves, it rips another piece of my throat out. That's how it feels, anyway. What big eyes you have, Grandma, Eddie said, not moving. What in the hell's name are you talking about? A fairy tale. Eddie did descend a short way, back down the slope, 4 yards, no more. And fairy tales are what you're thinking about if you believe you can coax me close enough to that wheelchair. Close enough for what? I don't understand, Roland said, although he understood perfectly. Nearly 150 yards above them, and perhaps a full quarter of a mile to the east, dark eyes full of intelligence as they were lacking in human mercy, watched this tableau intently. It was impossible to tell what they were saying. The wind, the waves, and the hollow crash of the surf digging its underground channel saw to that, but Detta didn't need to hear what they were saying to know what they were talking about. She didn't need a telescope to see that the really bad man was now also the really sick man, and maybe the really bad man was willing to spend a few days or even a few weeks torturing a legless Negro woman. The way things looked round here, entertainment was mighty hard to come by. But she thought the really sick man only wanted one thing, and that was to get his white bread ass out of here. Just use that magic doorway to haul the fucker out. But before, he hadn't been haulin' no ass. Before, he hadn't been haulin' nothin'. Before, the really bad man hadn't been nowhere but inside her own head. She still didn't like to think of how that had been, how it had felt, how easily he had overridden all her clawing efforts to push him out, away, to take control of herself again. That had been awful, terrible, and what made it worse was her lack of understanding. What exactly was the real source of her terror? That it wasn't the invasion itself was frightening enough. She knew that she might understand if she examined herself more closely, but she didn't want to do that. Such examinations might lead her to a place like the one sailors had feared in the ancient days, a place which was no more or less than the edge of the world, a place where the cartographers had marked with the legend, "Here there be serpents." The hideous thing about the really bad man's invasion had been the sense of familiarity that had came with it, as if this amazing thing had happened before, not once, but many times. But frightened or not, she had denied panic. She had observed even as she fought, and she remembered looking into that door when the gunslinger used her hands to pivot the wheelchair toward it. She remembered seeing the body of the really bad man lying on the sand, with Eddie crouched above it, a knife in his hands. Would that Eddie had plunged that knife into the really bad man's throat. Better than a pig slaughtering. Better by a country mile. He hadn't. But she had seen the really bad man's body. It had been breathing, but the body was the right word just the same. It had only been a worthless thing, like a cast-off tow sack which some idiot had stuffed full of weeds or corn shucks. Detta's mind might have been as ugly as a rat's ass, but it was even quicker and sharper than Eddie's. Really bad man there used to be full of piss and vinegar. Not no more. He know I'm up here, and doesn't want to do nothin' but get away before I come down and kill his ass. His little buddy, though, he still be pretty strong, and he ain't had his fill of hurtin' on me just yet. Want to come up here and hunt me down, no matter how that really bad man be. Sho, he be thinkin', One black bitch without legs ain't no match for a big ol' swinging dick like me. I don't want to run. I want to be hunting that black quiff down. I'll give her a poke or two, then we can go like you want. That's what he be thinking. And that be all right. That be just fine, Gray Meat. You think you can take Detta Walker. You just come on up here in these drawers and give her a try. You gonna find out when you fucking with me. You fucking with the best, honey bunch. You gonna find out. But she was jerked from the rat run of her thoughts by a sound that came to her clearly in spite of the surf and the wind, the heavy crack of a pistol shot. I think you understand better than you let on, Eddie said. A whole hell of a lot better. You'd like for me to get in grabbing distance. That's what I think. He jerked his head toward the door without taking his eyes from Roland's face, unaware that not far away someone was thinking exactly the same thing. He added, I know you're sick, all right, but it could be you're pretending to be a lot weaker than you really are. Could be you're laying back in the tall grass just a little bit. Could be I am, Roland said, unsmiling, and added, but I'm not. He was, though. A little. A few more steps wouldn't hurt, though, would it? I'm not going to be able to shout much longer. The last syllable turned into a frog's croak, as if to prove his point. And I need to make you think about what you're doing, planning to do. If I can't persuade you to come with me, maybe I can at least put you on guard. On your guard again. For your precious tower, Eddie sneered, but he did come skidding halfway down the slope of ground he had climbed, his tattered tennies kicking up listless clouds of maroon dust. For my precious tower and your precious health, the gunslinger said, not to mention your precious life. He slipped the remaining revolver from his left holster and looked at it with an expression both sad and strange. If you think you can scare me with that, I don't. You know I can't shoot you, Eddie. But I think you need an object lesson in how things have changed, how much things have changed. Roland lifted the gun. Its muzzle pointed not toward Eddie, but toward the empty, surging ocean, and thumbed the hammer. Eddie steeled himself against the gun's heavy crack. No such thing. Only a dull click. Roland thumbed the hammer back again. The cylinder rotated. He squeezed the trigger, and again there was nothing but a dull click. Never mind, Eddie said. Where I come from, the Defense Department would have hired you after the first misfire. You might as well quit. But the heavy kablam of the revolver cut off the word's end as neatly as Roland had cut small branches from a trees as target shooting exercise when he had been a student. Eddie jumped. The gunshot momentarily silenced the constant "wee" sound of the insects in the hills. They only began to tune up again slowly, cautiously, after Roland had put the gun in his lap. What in the hell does that prove? I suppose that all depends on what you'll listen to and what you refuse to hear, Roland said a trifle sharply. It's supposed to prove that not all the shells are duds. Furthermore, it strongly suggests, that some, maybe even all of the shells in the gun you gave Odetta may be live. Bullshit, Eddie paused. Why? Because I loaded the gun I just fired with shells from the backs of my gun belts, with shells that took the worst wetting, in other words. I did it to pass the time while you were gone, not that it takes much time to load a gun, even shy a pair of fingers, you understand? Roland laughed a little, and the laugh turned into a cough he muzzled with an abridged fist. When the cough had subsided, he went on. But after you've tried to fire wets, you have to break the machine and clean the machine, break the machine, clean the machine, you maggots. It was the first thing Court, our teacher, drummed into us. I didn't know how long it would take me to break down my gun, clean it, and put it back together with only one hand and a half, but I thought if I intended to go on living, and I do, Eddie, I do, I'd better find out. Find out and then learn to do it faster. Don't you think so? Come a little closer, Eddie. Come a little closer for your father's sake. All the better to see you with, my child, Eddie said. But he did take a couple of steps closer to Roland. Only a couple. When the first slug I pulled the trigger on fired, I almost filled my pants, the gunslinger said. He laughed again. Shocked, Eddie realized the gunslinger had reached the edge of delirium. The first slug. But believe me when I say it was the last thing I had expected. Eddie tried to decide if the gunslinger was lying about the gun and lying about his condition as well. Cat was sick, yeah, but was he really this sick? Eddie didn't know. If Roland was acting, he was doing a great job. As for guns, Eddie had no way of telling because he had no experience with them. He had shot a pistol maybe 3 times in his life before suddenly finding himself in a firefight at Balazar's place. Henry might have known, but Henry was dead. A thought which had a way of constantly surprising Eddie into grief. None of the others fired, the gunslinger said. So I cleaned the machine, reloaded, and fired the chamber again. This time I used shells a little further toward the belt buckles, ones which would have taken even less of a wetting. The loads we used to kill our food, the dry loads, were the ones closest to the buckles. He paused to cough dryly into his hands, that went on. Second time around, I hit 2 live rounds. I broke my gun down again, cleaned it again, and then loaded a third time. You just watch me drop the trigger on the first 3 chambers of that third loading. He smiled faintly. You know, after the first 2 clicks, I thought it would be my damn luck to have filled the cylinder with nothing but wets. That wouldn't have been very convincing, would it? Can you come a little closer, Eddie? Not very convincing at all, Eddie said, and I think I'm just as close to you as I'm going to come, thanks. What lesson am I supposed to take from all this, Roland? Roland looked at him as one might look at an imbecile. I didn't send you out here to die, you know. I didn't send either of you out here to die. Great gods, Eddie, where are your brains? She's packing live iron. His eyes regarded Eddie closely. She's someplace up in those hills. Maybe you think you can track her. Maybe you think you're not going to have any luck if the ground is as stony as it looks from here. She's lying up there, Eddie. Not Odetta, but Detta. Lying up there with live iron in her hands. If I leave you and you go after her, she'll blow your guts out from your asshole. Another spasm of coughing set in. Eddie stared at the coughing man in the wheelchair, and the waves pounded and the wind blew its steady idiot's note. At last he heard his voice say, You could have held back one shell you knew was live. I wouldn't put it past you. And with that said, he knew it to be true, and he wouldn't put that or anything else past Roland. His tower, his goddamn tower. And the slyness of putting that saved shell in the third cylinder, it provided just the right touch of reality, didn't it? Made it hard not to believe. We've got a saying in my world, Eddie said, that the guy could sell frigid airs to the Eskimos. That's the saying. What does it mean? It means go pound sand. The gunslinger looked at him for a long moment and then nodded. You mean to stay? All right. As Detta, she's safer from whatever wildlife there may be around here than she would have been as Odetta. And you'd be safer away from her, at least for the time being, but I can see how it is. I don't like it, but I've no time to argue with a fool. Does that mean, Eddie asked politely, that no one ever tried to argue with you about this dark tower you seem set on getting to? Roland smiled tiredly. My goodness. Roland smiled tiredly. A great many did, as a matter of fact. I suppose that's why I recognize you'll not be moved. One fool knows another. At any rate, I'm too weak to catch you. You're obviously too wary to let me coax you close enough to grab you, and time's grown too short to argue. All I can do is go and hope for the best. I'm going to tell you one last time before I do go, and hear me, Eddie. Be on your guard. Then Roland did something that made Eddie ashamed of all his doubts, although no less solidly set in his own decision. He flicked open the cylinder of the revolver with a practiced flick of his wrist, dumped all the loads, and replaced them with fresh loads from the loops closest to his buckles. He snapped the cylinder back into place, and with another flick of his wrist, No time to clean the machine now, he said, but 'twon't matter, I reckon. Now catch and catch clean. Don't dirty the machine any more than it is already. There aren't many machines left in my world that work anymore. He threw the gun across the space between them. In his anxiety, Eddie almost did drop it, Then he had it safely tucked into his waistband. The gunslinger got out of the wheelchair, almost fell when it slid backward under his pushing hands, then tottered to the doorway. He grasped its knob in his hand and it turned easily. Eddie could not see the scene the door opened upon, but he heard the muffled sound of traffic. Roland looked back at Eddie, his blue bullshooter's eyes gleaming out of a face which was ghastly pale. Detta watched all of this from her hiding place with hungrily gleaming eyes. "Remember, Eddie," he said in a hoarse voice, then stepped forward. His body collapsed at the edge of the doorway, as if it had struck a stone wall instead of empty space. Eddie felt an almost insatiable urge to go to the doorway, to look through and see where and to what when it led. Instead, he turned and scanned the hills again, his hand on the gun butt. "I'm going to tell you one last time." Suddenly, scanning the empty brown hills, Eddie was scared. "Be on your guard." Nothing up there was moving, nothing he could see, at least. He sensed her all the same. Not Odetta, the gunslinger had been right about that. It was Detta he sensed. He swallowed and heard a click in his throat. "On your guard." "Yes, but never." "We're competing. She's talking to the neighbor's dog, in case you're wondering. One moment." "Yes, but never in life had he felt such a deadly need for sleep. He would take him soon enough. If he didn't give in willingly, sleep would rape him, and while he slept, Detta would come." Detta. Eddie fought the weariness, looked at the unmoving hills with eyes which felt swollen and heavy, and wondered how long it might be before Roland came back with the third, the pusher, whoever he or she was. Odetta?" he called, without much hope. Only silence answered. And for Eddie, the time of waiting began. "Okay, one sec." Okay, now we're on the pusher. And in 2 chapters, we will be caught up to where I left off last time. And so I will stop there, and then this evening we will finish book 2. Okay, so chapter 1, Bitter Medicine. When the gunslinger entered Eddie, Eddie had experienced a moment of nausea, and he had a sense of being watched. This Roland hadn't felt, Eddie had told him later. He'd had, in other words, some vague sense of the gunslinger's presence. With Detta, Roland had been forced to come forward immediately, like it or not. She hadn't just sensed him. In a queer way, it seemed that she had been waiting for him or another, more frequent visitor. Either way, she had been totally aware of his presence from the first moment he had been in her. Jack Mort didn't feel a thing. He was too intent on the boy. He had been watching the boy for the last 2 weeks. Today, he was going to push him. Even with the back to the eyes from which the gunslinger now looked, Roland recognized the boy. It was the boy he had met at the way station in the desert, the boy he had rescued from the oracle in the mountains, the boy whose life he had sacrificed when the choice between saving him or finally catching up with the man in black finally came. The boy who had said, "Go then, there are other worlds than these," before plunging into the abyss. And sure enough, the boy had been right. The boy was Jake. He was holding a plain brown paper bag in one hand and a blue canvas bag by its drawstring top in the other. From the angles poking against the sides of the canvas, the gunslinger thought it must contain books. Traffic flooded the street the boy was waiting to cross, a street in the same city from which he had taken the prisoner and the lady, he realized. But for the moment, none of that mattered. Nothing mattered but what was going to happen or not happen in the next few seconds. Jake had not been brought into the gunslinger's world through any magic door. He had come through a cruder, more understandable portal. He had been born into Roland's world by dying in his own. He had been murdered. More specifically, he had been pushed. Pushed into the street, run over by a car while on his way to school, his lunch sack in one hand and his books in the other. Pushed by the man in black. He's going to do it. He's going to do it right now. That's my punishment for murdering him in my world, to see him murdered in this one before I can stop it. But the rejection of this brutish destiny had been the gunslinger's work all his life. It had been his ka, if you please, and so he came forward without even thinking, acting with reflexes so deep they had nearly become instinct. And as he did, a thought both horrible and ironic flashed into his mind. What if the body he had entered was itself that of the man in black? What if, as he rushed forward to save the boy, he saw his own hands reach out and push? What if this sense of control was only an illusion and Walter's final gleeful joke that Roland himself should murder the boy? For one single moment, Jack Mort lost the thin, strong arrow of his concentration. On the edge of leaping forward and shoving the kid in the traffic, he felt something which his mind mistranslated, just as the body may refer pain from one part of itself to another. When the gunslinger came forward, Jack thought some sort of bug had landed on the back of his neck. Not a wasp or a bee, nothing that actually stung, but something that bit and itched. Mosquito, maybe? It was on this that he blamed his lapse in concentration at the crucial moment. He slapped at it and returned to the boy. He thought all this happened in a bare wink. Actually, 7 seconds passed. He sensed neither the gunslinger's swift advance nor his equally swift retreat. And none of the people around him, going to work people, most of them from the subway station on the next block, their faces still puffy with sleep, their half-dreaming eyes turned inward, noticed Jack's eyes turn from their usual deep blue to a lighter blue behind the prim gold-rimmed glasses he wore. No one noticed those eyes darken to their normal cobalt color either. But when it happened, and he refocused on the boy, he saw with frustrated fury as sharp as a thorn, that his chance was gone. The light had changed. He watched the boy crossing with the rest of the sheep, and then Jack himself turned back the way he had come and began shoving himself upstream against the tidal flow of pedestrians. "Hey, mister, watch out!" some curd-faced teenage girl he barely saw. Jack shoved her aside, hard, not looking back at her caw of anger as her own armload of schoolbooks went flying. He went walking down on Fifth Avenue and away from 43rd, where he had meant for the boy to die today. His head was bent, his lips pressed together so tightly he seemed to have no mouth at all, but only the scar of a long-healed wound above his chin. Once clear of the bottleneck at the corner, he did not slow down, but strode even more rapidly along, crossing 42nd, 41st, 40th. Somewhere in the middle of the next block, he passed the building where the boy lived. He gave it barely a glance. Although he had followed the boy from it every school morning for the last 3 weeks, followed him from the building to the corner, 3.5 blocks further up Fifth, the corner he thought of simply as the pushing place. The girl he bumped was screaming after him, but Jack Mort didn't notice. An amateur lepidopterist would have taken no more notice of a common butterfly. Jack was, in his way, much like an amateur lepidopterist. By profession, he was a successful CPA. Pushing was only his hobby. The gunslinger returned to the back of the man's mind and fainted there. If there was relief, it was simply that this man was not the man in black, was not Walter. All the rest was utter horror, an utter realization. Divorced of his body, his mind, his ka, was as healthy and acute as ever, but the sudden knowing struck him like a chisel blow to the temple. The knowing didn't come when he went forward, but when he was sure the boy was safe and slipped back again. He saw the connection between this man and Odetta, too fantastic and yet too hideously apt to be coincidental, and understood what the real drawing of the three might be and who they might be. The third was not this man, this pusher. The third, the third named by Walter, had been Death. Death, but not for you. That was what Walter, clever as Satan even at the end, had said, a lawyer's answer. So close to the truth that the truth was able to hide in its shadow, death was not for him. Death was become him. The prisoner, the lady, death was the third. He was suddenly filled with the certainty that he himself was the third. Roland came forward as nothing but a projectile, a brainless missile programmed to launch the body. He was in at the man in black the instant he saw him. Thoughts of what might happen if he stopped the man in black from murdering Jake did not come until later. The possible paradox, the fistula in time and dimension which might cancel out everything that had happened after he had arrived at the way station. For surely if he saved Jake in this world, there would have been no Jake for him to meet there, and everything which had happened thereafter would change. What changes? Impossible even to speculate on them. That one might have been the end of his quest never entered the gunslinger's mind, and surely such an after-the-fact speculations were moot. If he had seen the man in black, no consequence, paradox, or ordained course of destiny could have stopped him from simply lowering the head of this body he inhabited and pounding it straight through Walter's chest. Roland would have been as helpless to do otherwise as a gun is helpless to refuse the finger that squeezes the trigger and flings the bullet on its flight. If it sent all to hell, the hell with it. He scanned the people clustered on the corner quickly, seeing each face. He scanned the woman as closely as the men, making sure there wasn't one only pretending to be a woman. Walter wasn't there. Gradually he relaxed, as a finger curled around a trigger may relax at the last instant. No, Walter was nowhere around the boy, and the gunslinger somehow felt sure that this wasn't the right when. Not quite. That when was close, 2 weeks away, a week, maybe even a single day. Maybe it was not quite yet. So he went back. On the way, he saw and fell senseless with shock. This man into whose mind the third door opened had once sat waiting just inside the window of a deserted tenement room in a building full of abandoned rooms. Abandoned, that was, except for the winos and crazies who often spent their nights here. You knew about the winos because you could smell their desperate sweat and angry piss. You knew about the crazies because you could smell the stink of their deranged thoughts. The only furniture in this room was 2 chairs. Jack Mort was using both. One to sit in, one as a prop to keep the door opening on the hallway closed. He expected no sudden interruptions, but it was best not to take chances. He was close enough to the window to look out, but far enough behind the slanted shadow line to be safe from any casual viewer. He had a crumbly red brick in his hand. He had a piece of it from He had pried it from just outside the window, where a good many were loose. It was old, eroded at the corners, but heavy. Chunks of ancient mortar clung to it like barnacles. The man meant to drop the brick on someone. He didn't care who. When it came to murder, Jack Mort was an equal opportunity employer. After a bit, a family of 3 came along the sidewalk below. Man, woman, little girl. The girl had been walking on the inside, presumably to keep her safely away from the traffic. There was quite a lot of this close to the railway station, but Jack Mort didn't care about the auto traffic. What he cared about was the lack of buildings directly opposite of him. These had already been demolished, leaving a jumbled wasteland of splintered board, broken brick, and glinting glass. He would only lean out for a few seconds, and he was wearing sunglasses over his eyes and out-of-season knit cap over his blonde hair. It was like the chair under the doorknob. Even when you were safe from expected risks, there was no harm in reducing those unexpected ones which remained. He was also wearing a sweatshirt much too big for him, one that came almost down to mid thigh. This bag of a garment would help confuse the actual size and shape of his body. He was quite thin. Should he be observed? It served another purpose as well. Whenever he depth charged someone, for that was how he always thought of it, as depth charging, he came in his pants. The baggy sweatshirt also covered the wet spot which invariably formed on his jeans. Now they were closer. Don't jump the gun. Wait. Just wait. He shivered at the edge of the window, brought the brick forward, drew it back to his stomach, brought it forward again, withdrew it again, but this time only halfway, and then leaned out, totally cool now. He always was at the penultimate moment. He dropped the brick and watched it fall. It went down, swapping one end for the other. Jack saw the clinging barnacles of mortar clearly in the sun. At these moments, as at no others, everything was clear. Everything stood out with exact and geometrically perfect substance. Here was a thing which he had pushed into reality, as a sculptor swings a hammer against a chisel to change stone and create some new substance from the brute caldera. Here was the world's most remarkable thing, logic, which was also ecstasy. Sometimes he missed or struck aslant, or the sculptor may carve badly, or as the sculptor may carve badly or in vain, but this was a perfect shot. The brick struck the little girl in the bright gingham dress squarely on the head. He saw blood. It was brighter than the brick, but would eventually dry to the same maroon color, splash up. He heard the start of the mother's scream. Then he was moving. Jack crossed the room and threw the chair which had been under the doorknob into a far corner. He'd kicked the other, the one he'd sat in while waiting, aside as he crossed the room. He yanked up the sweatshirt and pulled a bandana from his back pocket. He used it to turn the knob. No fingerprints allowed. Only don't bees left fingerprints. He stuffed the bandana into his back pocket again, even as the door was swinging open. As he walked down the hall, he assumed a fairly drunken gait. He didn't look around. Looking around was also only for don't bees. Doobies knew that trying to see if someone was noticing you was a sure way to accomplish just that. Looking around was the sort of thing a witness might remember after an accident. Then some smart-ass cop might decide it was a suspicious accident, and there would be an investigation, all because of one nervous glance around. Jack didn't believe anyone could connect him with the crime, even if someone decided the accident was suspicious and there was an investigation, but take only acceptable risks, minimize those which remain. In other words, always prop a chair under the doorknob. So he walked down the powdery corridor where patches of lathing showed through the plaster walls. He walked with his head down, mumbling to himself like the vags you saw in the street. He could still hear the woman, the mother of the little girl, he supposed, screaming. But that sound was coming from the front of the building. It was faint and unimportant. All of the things which happened after. The cries, the confusion, the wails of the wounded, if the wounded were still capable of wailing, were not things which mattered to Jack. What mattered was the thing which pushed the change into the ordinary course of things and sculpted new lines in the flow of lives, and perhaps the destinies not only for those struck, but of a widening circle around them, like ripples from a stone tossed into a still pond. Who was to say that he had not sculpted the cosmos today, or might not at some future time? God, no wonder he creamed his jeans. He met no one as he went down the 2 flights of stairs, but he kept up the act, swaying a little as he went, but never reeling. A swayer would not be remembered. An ostentatious reeler might be. He muttered, but didn't actually say anything a person might understand. Not acting at all would be better than hamming it up. He let himself out of the broken rear door into the alley, filled with refuse and broken bottles which twinkled galaxies of sun stars. He had planned his escape in advance, as he planned everything in advance. Take only acceptable risks, minimize those which remain, be a doobie in all things. Such planning was why he had been marked by his colleagues as a man who would go far, and he did intend to go far. But one of the places he did not intend to go was jail or the electric chair. A few people were running along the streets into which the alley debauched, but they were on their way to see what the screaming was about, and none of them looked at Jack Mort, who had removed the out of season knit cap, but not the sunglasses, which on such a bright morning did not seem out of place. He turned into another alley, came out on another street. Now he sauntered down an alley, not so filthy as the first two, almost in fact a lane. This fed into another street, and a block up there was a bus stop. Less than a minute after he got there, a bus arrived, which was also part of the schedule. Jack entered when the doors accordioned open and dropped his 15 cents into the slot of the coin receptacle. The driver did not so much as glance at him. That was good. But even if he had, he would have seen nothing but a nondescript man in jeans, a man who might be out of work, the sweatshirt he was wearing looking like something out of a Salvation Army grab bag. Be ready. Be prepared. Be a doobie. Jack Mort's secret for success both at work and at play. 9 blocks away there was a parking lot. Jack got off the bus and entered the lot, unlocked his car, an unremarkable mid-50s Chevrolet which was still in fine shape, and drove back to New York City. He was free and clear. The gunslinger saw all of this in a mere moment. Before his shocked mind could shut out the other images by simply shutting down, he saw more. Not all, but enough. Enough. He saw Mort cutting a piece from the page for the New York Daily Mirror with an X-Acto knife, being fussily sure to stay exactly upon the lines of the column. Negro girl comatose following tragic accident, the headline read. He saw Mort apply glue to the back of the clipping with a brush attached to the cover of his paste pot, saw Mort position it at the center of a blank page of a scrapbook which, from the bumpy, swelled look of the foregoing pages, contained many other clippings. He saw the opening lines of the piece. 5-year-old Odetta Holmes, who came to Elizabethtown, New Jersey, to celebrate a joyous occasion, is now the victim of a cruel freak accident. Following the wedding of an aunt 2 days ago, the girl and her family were walking toward the railway station when a brick tumbled. But that wasn't the only time he'd had dealings with her, was it? No, gods, no. In the years between that morning and the night when Odetta had lost her legs, Jack Mort had dropped a great many things and pushed a great many people. Then there had been Odetta again. The first time, he had pushed something on her. The second time, he had pushed her in front of something. What sort of man is this that I'm supposed to use? What sort of man? But then he thought of Jake. Thought of the push which had sent Jake into his world, and he thought he heard the laughter of the man in black, and that finished him. Roland fainted. When he came to, he was looking at neat rows of figures marching down a sheet of green paper. The paper had been rolled both ways, so that each single figure looked like a prisoner in a cell. He thought something else. Not just Walter's laugh. Something, a plan. No, gods, no. Nothing as complex or as hopeful as that, but an idea, at least. A tickle. How long have I been out? He thought with sudden alarm. It was maybe 9 o'clock when I came through the door, maybe a little earlier. How long? He came forward. Jack Mort, who was now only a human doll controlled by the gunslinger, looked up a little and saw the hands of the expensive quartz clock on his desk stood at 1:15. God, it's as late as that? As late as that? But Eddie, he was so tired he can never have stayed awake for so long. The gunslinger turned Jack's head. The door was still there, but what he saw through it was far worse than he would have imagined. Standing to one side of the door were 2 shadows. One that of the wheelchair, the other that of a human being. But the human being was incomplete, supporting itself on its arms because its lower legs had been snatched away with the same quick brutality as Roland's fingers and toes. in tow. The shadow moved. Roland whipped Jack Mort's head away at once, moving with the whiplash speed of a striking snake. She mustn't look in. Not until I'm ready. Until then, she sees nothing but the back of this man's head. Detta Walker would not see Jack Mort's eyes in any case because the person who looked through the open door saw only what the host saw. She could only see Mort's face if he looked into a mirror, although that might lead into his own awful consequences of paradox and repetition. But even then, it would mean nothing to either lady. For that matter, the lady's face would not mean anything to Jack Mort. Although they had twice been on terms of deadly intimacy, they had never seen each other. What the gunslinger didn't want was for the lady to see the lady. Not yet, at least. The spark of intuition grew closer to a plan, but it was late over there. The light had suggested to him that it might be 3 in the afternoon, perhaps even 4. How long until sunset brought the lobstrosities and the end of Eddie's life? 3 hours? 2? He could go back and try to save Eddie, but that was exactly what Detta wanted. She had laid a trap, just as villagers who feared a deadly wolf may take out a sacrificial lamb to draw it into bowshot. He would go back into his diseased body, but not for long. The reason he had seen only her shadow was because she was lying beside the door with one of his revolvers curled in her fist. The moment his Roland body moved, she would shoot it and end his life. His ending, because she feared him, would at least be merciful. Eddie would be a screaming horror. He seemed to hear Detta Walker's nasty, giggling voice. "You want to go at me, gray meat? So you want to go at me? You ain't afraid of no little old crippled black woman, are you?" "Only one way," Jack's mouth muttered. "Only one." The door of the office opened, and a bald man with lenses over his eyes looked in. "How are you doing on that Dorfman account?" the bald man asked. "I feel ill. I think it was my lunch. I think I might leave." The bald man looked worried. "It's probably a bug. I heard there's a nasty one going around." "Probably. Well, as long as you get the Dorfman stuff finished by 5 tomorrow afternoon." "Yes." "Because you know what a dong he can be." "Yes." The bald man, now looking a little uneasy, nodded. "Yes, go home. You don't seem like your usual self at all." "I'm not." The bald man went out the door in a hurry. He sensed me, the gunslinger thought. That was part of it. Part, but not all. They're afraid of him. They don't know why, but they're afraid of him, and they're right to be afraid. Jack Mort's body got up, found the briefcase the man had been carrying when the gunslinger entered him, and swept all the papers on the surface of the desk into it. He felt an urge to sneak a look back at the door and resisted it. He would not look again until he was ready to risk everything and come back. In the meantime, time was short, and there were things which had to be done. Chapter 2. The Honey Pot. Detta laid up in a deeply shadowed cleft formed by the rocks which leaned together like old men who had been turned into stone while sharing some weird secret. She watched Eddie range up and down the rubble-strewn slopes of the hills, yelling himself hoarse. The duck fuzz on his cheeks was finally becoming a beard, and you might have taken him for a grown man except for the 3 or 4 times he passed close to her. Once he come close enough for her to have snaked a hand out and grabbed his ankle. When he got close, you saw he was nothing but a kid still, and one that was dog-tired to boot. Odetta would have felt pity. Detta felt only the still coiled readiness of the natural predator. When she first crawled in here, she had felt things crackling under her hands like old autumn leaves in a woods holler. As her eyes adjusted, she saw they weren't leaves but tiny bones of small animals. Some predator, long gone if these ancient yellow bones told the truth, had once denned here. Something like a weasel or a ferret. It had perhaps gone out at night, following its nose further up into the drawers to where the trees and undergrowth were thicker. Following its nose to prey, it had killed, eaten, and brought the remains back here to snack on the following day as it laid up, waiting for night to bring the time of hunting on again. Now there was a bigger predator here, and at first Detta thought she'd do pretty much what the previous tenant had done. Wait until Eddie fell asleep, as he was almost certain to do, then kill him and drag his body up here. Then, with both guns in her possession, she could drag herself back down by the doorway and wait for the really bad man to come back. Her first thought had been to kill the really bad man's body as soon as she had taken care of Eddie, but that was no good, was it? If the really bad man had no body to come back to, there would be no way Detta could get back out of here and back to her own world. Could she make the really bad man take her back? Maybe not, but maybe so. If he knew Eddie was still alive, maybe so. And that led to a much better idea. She was deeply sly. She would have laughed harshly at anyone daring to suggest it, but she was also deeply insecure. Because of the latter, she attributed the the former to anyone she met whose intellect seemed to approach her own. This was how she felt about the gunslinger. She had heard a shot, and when she looked, she'd seen smoke drifting from the muzzle of his remaining gun. He had loaded and tossed this gun to Eddie just before going through the door. She knew what it was supposed to mean to Eddie. All the shells weren't wet after all. The gun would protect him. She also knew what it was supposed to mean to her. For of course the really bad man had known she was watching, even if she had been sleeping when the two of them started chinning. The shot would have awakened her. Stay away from him. He's packing. But devils could be subtle. If that little show had been put on for her benefit, might not the really bad man have had another purpose in mind as well? One neither she nor Eddie was supposed to see. Might that really bad man not be thinking, if she sees this one fires good shells, why, she'll think the one she took from Eddie does too. But suppose she had guessed that Eddie would doze off. Wouldn't he know she would be waiting for just that, waiting to filch the gun and creep slowly away up the slopes to safety? Yes, that really bad man might have foreseen all that. He was smart for a honky. Smart enough, anyway, to see that Detta was bound to get the best of that little white boy. So just maybe that really bad man had purposefully loaded this gun with bad shells. He had fooled her once, why not again? This time, she had been careful to check that the chambers were loaded with more than empty casings, and yes, they appeared to be real bullets, but that didn't mean they were. He didn't even have to take the chance that one of them might be dry enough to fire, now did he? He could have fixed them somehow. After all, guns were the really bad man's business. Why would he do that? Why? To trick her into showing herself, of course. Then Eddie could cover her with the gun that really did work, and he would not make the same mistake twice, tired or not. He would, in fact, be especially careful not to make the same mistake twice because he was tired. Nice try, Honky, Detta thought in her shadowy den. This tight, but somehow comforting dark place whose floor was carpeted with the softening and decaying bones of small animals. Nice try, but I ain't going for that shit. She didn't need to shoot Eddie after all. She only needed to wait. Her one fear was that the gunslinger would return before Eddie fell asleep, but he was still gone. The limp body at the base of the door did not stir. Maybe he was having some trouble getting the medicine he needed. Some other kind of trouble for all she knew. Men like him seemed to find trouble easy as a bitch in heat finds a randy hound. 2 hours passed while Eddie hunted for the woman he called Odetta. Oh, how she hated the sound of that name. Ranging up and down the low hills and yelling it until he had no voice left to yell with. At last, Eddie did what she had been waiting for. He went back down to the little angle of beach and sat by the wheelchair, looking around disconsolately. He he touched the wheelchair, looking around disconsolately. He what the hell? Why does it? Okay, I think there's a misprint in this book, but we're gonna ignore it. He touched one of the chair's wheels with a touch that was almost a caress. Then his hand dropped away, and he fetched him a deep sigh. This sight brought a steely ache to Detta's throat. Pain bolted across her head from one side to the other like summer lightning, and she seemed to hear a voice calling on, or demanding. No, you don't, she thought. Have no idea who she was thinking about or speaking to. No, you don't. Not this time. Not now. Not now. Maybe not ever again. That bolt of pain ripped through her head again, and she curled her hands into a fist. Her face made its own expression, remarkable and arresting in its mixture of ugliness an almost beatific determination. That bolt of pain did not come again. Neither did the voice which sometimes seemed to speak through such pains. She waited. Eddie propped his chin on his fist, propping his head up. Soon it began to droop away and droop anyway, the fist sliding up his cheeks. Detta waited, black eyes gleaming. Eddie's head jerked up. He struggled to his feet, walked down to the water, and splashed his face with it. "Dat's right, white boy. Cryin' shame there ain't no no-dos in this world, or you be taking that too, ain't that right?" Eddie sat down in the wheelchair this time, but evidently found that just a little too comfortable. So after a long look through the open door, "What you seein' in there, white boy? Detta give a $20 bill to know that." He plopped his ass down on the sand again, propped his head up with his hands again, and soon his head began to slip down again. This time there was no stopping it. His chin lay on his chest, and even over the surf he could hear him snoring. Pretty soon he fell on his side and curled up. She was surprised, disgusted, and frightened to feel a sudden stab of pity for the white boy down there. He looked like nothing so much as a little squirt who had tried to stay up until midnight on New Year's Eve and lost the race. Then she remembered the way he and the really bad man had tried to get her to eat poisoned food and teased her with their own, always snatching away at the last second, at least until they got scared she might die. If they were scared you might die, why'd they try to get you to eat poison in the first place? The question scared her the way that momentary feeling of pity had scared her. She wasn't used to questioning herself, and furthermore, the questioning voice in her mind didn't seem like her voice at all. "Wasn't meanin' to kill me with that poisoned food, just wanted to make me sick. Set me there and laugh while I puke and moan, I spec." She waited 20 minutes and then started down toward the beach, pulling herself with her hands and strong arms, weaving like a snake, eyes never leaving Eddie. She would have preferred to have waited another hour, even another half hour. It would have been better to have the little Muffas 10 miles asleep instead of 1 or 2, but waiting was a luxury she simply could not afford. That really bad man might come back any minute. As she drew near the place where Eddie lay, he was still snoring. Sounded like a buzz saw in a sawmill about to go tits up. She picked up a chunk of rock that was satisfyingly smooth on one side and satisfyingly jagged on the other. She closed her palm over the smooth side and continued her snake-like crawl to where he lay, the flat sheen of murder in her eyes. What Detta planned to do was brutally simple: smash Eddie with the jagged side of the rock until he was as dead as the rock itself. Then she'd take the gun and wait for Roland to come back. When his body sat up, she would give him a choice: take her back to her world or refuse and be killed. You gonna be quits with me either way, Toots," she would say. "And with your boyfriend dead, ain't nothin' more you can do like you said you wanted to." If the gun the really bad man had given Eddie didn't work, it was possible. She had never met a man she hated and feared as much as Roland, and she put no depth of slyness past him. She would do to him just the same. She would do to him with the rock or with her bare hands. He was sick and shy 2 fingers to boot. She could take him. But as she approached Eddie, a disquieting thought came to her. It was another question, and again it seemed to be another voice that asked it. What if he knows? What if he knows what you did the second you kill Eddie? He ain't gonna know nothin'. He be too busy gettin' his medicine, gettin' hisself laid, too, for all I know. The alien voice did not respond, but the seed of doubt had been planted. She had heard them talking when they thought she was asleep. The really bad man needed to do something. She didn't know what it was. Had something to do with the tower, was all Detta knew. Could be the really bad man thought his tower was full of gold or jewels or something like that. He said he needed her and Eddie and some other one to get there, and Detta guessed maybe he did. Why else would these doors be here? If it was magic and she killed Eddie, he might know. If she killed his way to the tower, she thought she might be killing the only thing Grey Meat Muffas was living for. And if he knew he had nothing to live for, Muffa might do anything, because the Muffas wouldn't give a bug turd for nothing no more. The idea of what might happen if the really bad man came back like that made Detta shiver. But if she couldn't kill Eddie, what was she going to do? She couldn't take the gun while Eddie was asleep, but when the really bad man came back, could she handle both of them? She just didn't know. Her eyes touched on the wheelchair, started to move away, then back again, fast. There was a deep pocket in the leather backrest. Poking out of this was a curl of rope they had used to tie her into the chair. Looking at it, she understood how she could do everything. Detta changed course and began to crawl towards the gunslinger's inert body. She meant to take what she needed from the knapsack he called his purse, then get the rope fast as she could, but for a moment she was held frozen by the door. Like Eddie, she interpreted what she was seeing in terms of the movies, only this looked more like some TV crime show. The setting was a drugstore. She was seeing a druggist who looked scared silly, and Detta didn't blame him. There was a gun pointed straight into the druggist's face. The druggist was saying something, but his voice was a distant, distorted, as if heard through sound baffles. She couldn't tell what it was. She couldn't see who was holding the gun either, but then she didn't really need to see the stick up man, did she? She knew who it was, sure. It was the really bad man. Might not look like him over there, might look like some tubby little sack of shit, might even look like a brother, but inside it be him, sho. Didn't take him long to find another gun, did it? I bet it never does. You get moving, Detta Walker. She opened Roland's purse, and the faint nostalgic aroma of tobacco, long hoarded but now long gone, drifted out. In one way, it was very much like a lady's purse filled with what looked like so much random rickrack at first glance. But a closer look showed you the traveling gear of a man prepared for almost any contingency. She had an idea that the really bad man had been on the road to his tower for a good long time. If that was so, just the amount of stuff still left in here, poor as some of it was cause for amazement. You get moving, Detta Walker. She got what she needed, and worked her silent, snake like way back to the wheelchair. When she got there, she propped herself up on one arm and pulled the rope out of the pocket like a fisherwoman reeling in a line. She glanced over at Eddie every now and then, just to make sure he was asleep. He never stirred until Detta threw the noose around his neck and pulled it taut. He was dragged backward, at first thinking he was still asleep and this was some horrible nightmare of being buried alive or perhaps smothered. Then he felt the pain of the noose sinking into his throat, felt warm spit running down his chin as he gagged. This was no dream. He clawed at the rope and tried for his feet. She yanked him hard and with strong arms. Eddie fell on his back with a thud, his face turning purple. Quit on it, Detta hissed from behind. I ain't gonna kill you if you quit on it, but if you don't, I'ma choke you dead. Eddie lowered his hands and tried to be still. The running slipknot Odetta had tossed over his neck loosened enough for him to draw a thin, burning breath. All you could say for it was that it was better than not breathing at all. When the panicked beating of his heart had slowed a little, he tried to look around. The noose immediately drew tight again. Never mind. You just go on and take in that ocean view, Gray Meat. That's all you want to be looking at right now. He looked back at the ocean and the knot loosened enough to allow him those miserably burning breaths again. His left hand crept surreptitiously down to the waistband of his pants, but he saw the movement, and although he didn't know it, she was grinning. There was nothing there. She had taken the gun. She crept up on you while you were asleep, Eddie. It was the gunslinger's voice, of course. It doesn't do any good to say I told you so now, but I told you so. This is what romance gets you, a noose around your neck, and a crazy woman with 2 guns somewhere behind your back. But if she was going to kill me, she already would have done it. She would have done it while I was asleep. And what is it you think she's going to do, Eddie? Hand you an all-expense-paid trip for 2 to Disney World? Listen, he said. Odetta. The word was barely out of his mouth before the noose pulled savagely tight again. You don't want to be calling me dat. Next time you be calling me dat be the last time you be calling anyone anything. My name's Detta Walker, and if you want to keep drawing breath into your lungs, you little piece of whitewashed shit, you better remember it. Eddie made choking, gagging noises and clawed at the noose. Big black spots of nothing began to explode in front of his eyes like evil flowers. At last the choking band around his throat eased again. Got that, honky? Yes, he said, but it was only a hoarse choke of sound.
Then say it. Say my name. Detta, say my whole name. Dangerous, hysterical, dangerous hysteria wavered in her voice, and at that moment Eddie was glad he couldn't see her. Detta Walker. Good. The noose eased a little more. Now you listen to me, Whitebread, and you do it good, if you want to live till sundown. You don't want to be trying to be cute, like I see you just trying to snake down and grab that gun I took off you while you was asleep. I don't want it. I don't want to, 'cause Detta, she got the sight. See what you gonna try before you try it, show. You don't want to try nuttin' cute, 'cause I ain't got no legs either. I've learned to do a lot of things since I lost 'em, and now I got both of that honky muffa's guns, and that ought to be going for something. You think so? Yeah, Eddie croaked. I'm not feeling cute. Well, good. That's real good, she cackled. I've been one busy bitch while you've been sleeping. Got this business all figured out. Here's what I want you to do, Whitebread. Put your hands behind you and feel around until you find a loop, just like the one I put around your neck. There'll be 3 of them. I be braiding while you be sleeping, lazy bones, she cackled. When you feel that loop, you gonna put your wrists right one against the other and slip 'em through it. Then you're going to feel my hand pulling that running knot tight. And when you feel that, you're going to say, this my chance to turn it around and disarm this nizzle bizzle right here while she ain't got her good hold on that jerk rope. But here Detta's voice became muffled as well as a southern dark caricature. You better take a look around before you go doing anything rash. Eddie did. Detta looked more witch-like than ever, a dirty, matted thing that would have struck fear into the hearts of much stouter than his own. The dress she had been wearing in Macy's when the gunslinger snatched her was now filthy and torn. She had used the knife she had taken from the gunslinger's purse, the one he had, the one he and Roland had used to cut the masking tape away, to slash her dress in 2 other places, creating makeshift holsters just above the swell of her hips. The word butts of the gunslinger's revolvers protruded from them. Her voice was muffled because the end of the rope was clenched in her teeth. A freshly cut end protruded from one side of her grin. The rest of the line, the part which led to the noose around his neck, protruded from one side. There was something so predatory and barbaric about this image, the rope caught in the grin, that he was frozen, staring at her with horror that only made her grin widen. You try to be cute while I be taking care of your hands, she said in her muffled voice. I can choke your windpipe shut with my teeth, Grey Meat. And that time I not be lettin' up again, you understand? He didn't trust himself to speak, he only nodded. Good. Maybe you be living a little bit longer after all. If I don't, Eddie croaked, you're never going to have the pleasure of shoplifting in Macy's again, Detta, because he'll know, and then it'll be everybody out of the pool. Hush up, Detta said, almost crooned. You just hush up. Leave the thinking to folks that can do it. All you got to do is be feeling around for the next loop. I've been braiding while you've been sleeping, she had said, and with disgust and mounting alarm, Eddie discovered she meant exactly what she said. The rope had become a series of 3 running slip knots. The first she had noosed around his neck as he slept. The second secured his hands behind his back, and the third pushed him roughly over on his side and told him to bring his feet up until his heels touched his butt. He saw where this was leading and balked. She pulled one of Roland's revolvers from the slit in her dress, cocked it, and pressed the muzzle against Eddie's temple. You do it or I do it, Grey Meat, she said in that crooning voice. Only if I do it, you can be dead when I do. I just kicked some sand over the brains that squirt out the other side your head, cover the hole with your hair. You think you be sleeping, she cackled again. Eddie brought his face up, and she quickly secured the third running slip knot around his ankles. There, tussed up just as neat as a calf at a rodeo. That described it as well as anything, Eddie thought. If he tried to bring his feet down from a position which was already growing uncomfortable, he would tighten the slip knot holding his ankles even more. That would tighten the length of rope between his ankles and his wrists, which would in turn tighten that slip knot, and the rope between his wrists and the noose she'd put around his neck, and she was dragging him, somehow dragging him, down the beach. Hey, what? He tried to pull back and felt everything tighten, including his ability to draw breath. He let himself go as limp as possible and kept those feet up. Keep those feet up. Don't forget that, asshole. Because if you lower your feet enough, you're going to strangle. And let her drag him along the rough ground. A jag of rock peeled skin away from his cheek, and he felt warm blood begin to flow. She was panting harshly. The sound of the waves and the boom of surf ramming into rock tunnels were louder. Drown me? Sweet Christ, is that what she means to do? No, of course not. He thought he knew what she meant to do even before his face plowed through the twisting kelp which marked the high tide line. Dead salt sinking stuff as cold as the fingers of drowned sailors. He remembered Henry saying once, sometimes they'd shoot one of our guys, an American, I mean. They knew an ARVN was no good because wasn't any of us that'd go after a gook in the bush, not unless he was some fresh fish just over from the States. They'd gut hole him, leave him screaming, then picking off the guys that tried to save him. They'd keep that going until the guy died. You know what they called a guy like that, Eddie? Eddie had shaken his head, cold with the vision of it. They called him a honeypot, Henry said. Something sweet, something to draw flies, or maybe even a bear. That's what Detta was doing, using him as a honeypot. She left him some 7 feet below the high tide line, left him without a word, left him facing the ocean. It was not the tide coming in to drown him that the gunslinger, looking through the door, was supposed to see, because the tide was on the ebb and wouldn't get up this far again for another 6 hours, and long before then. Eddie rolled his eyes up a little and saw the sun striking a long gold track across the ocean. What was it, 4 o'clock? About that. Sunset would come around 7. It would be dark long before he had to worry about the tide, and when the dark came, the lobstrosities would come rolling out of the waves. They would crawl their questioning way up the beach to where he lay helplessly trussed, and then they would tear him apart. That time stretched out interminably for Eddie Dean. The idea of time itself became a joke. Even his horror of what was going to happen to him when it got dark faded as his legs began to throb with the discomfort which worked its way up the scale of feeling to pain and finally to shrieking agony. He would relax his muscles, all the knots would pull tight, and when he was on the verge of strangling, he would manage somehow to pull his ankles up again, releasing the pressure, allowing some breath to return. He was no longer sure he could make it to dark. There might come a time when he would simply be unable to bring his legs back up. And on that note, we shall continue with part 9 tonight, and we will finish book 2 this evening. Sorry I had to take part 8 down previously, but I have replaced it. Okay, thank you, pretty shiny peoples, and I will see you later for the regular reading.